If those of you who are not seated comfortably want to come down, there are seats spread all through here. And I've seen the manuscript of the speech that's going to be delivered. And you want to have a comfortable seat.
It's large font.
I'm going to move away from this piece of technology. I'm going to move away from the technology and do so by saying that I could not possibly introduce Kevin. I have read the introduction that he prepared us with. I have known him for many years. I have admired him. He has been my assistant in good and bad dealings. And all of it, where I'm concerned, had to do with the support of public school teachers all across North Carolina, especially with regard to social studies and archives and history kind of support to the teacher corps in North Carolina. I have not read his speech, and if all of you who need a seat now have a seat, I'm going to give him the mic, and God bless you.
Hello. I am reassured by physics right now. You know, that discipline tells us that light travels faster than sound. And that being the case, then I'm relatively sure that I might seem bright right before you hear me. Former Archivist of the United States Ferriero, Justice Switchard, Representative Longest, former Secretaries Hamilton and Klutz, former Deputy Secretary Crow, Commissioner Goodwin, former State Archivist Langford, former State Librarians Owens and Boone Burnson, former Director of State History Museums Howard, former Director of State Parks and Recreation Murphy, former Director of Preservation North Carolina Howard, members of the North Carolina Historical Commission, distinguished professors, family, friends, neighbors, fellow Tar Heels. Thank y'all for being here. Scientists tell us that our world is made up of atoms. Protons, electrons, neutrons. Well, we all know that the world is actually made up of stories. The whos, whens, whats, wheres, leading up to those all-important whys. We know what we know because our stories tell us what we know. I, like most of you, have had the great good fortune of growing up in a storytelling family surrounded by a community of storytellers. I remember my great-grandfather's brother, my Uncle Horace, sitting in his chair on the corner of our front porch, wearing his overalls with its black shoestring, holding a pocket watch to his bib, one lanky leg thrown over the other and dangling a brogan. Over yonder, across that field, right around that wet spot in the gully, is where we cut the timber for this house. Used a tractor to run a crosscut saw. We cut stove wood with that same saw. Chopped Ralph Kelly's finger plumb off. The board bucked, and there it went. And a stream of tobacco juice would hit the Nandinas. Buried it in a mason jar in the backyard. I nearly dug up our entire yard that summer. On top of coming from a storytelling culture, I have been blessed to do a special kind of storytelling for both a vocation and hobby. Don't ask me where one begins and the other ends. I have no idea, and I have never known. I do know that history is a storytelling business, and it's not just any storytelling business. History's stories are based upon evidence, traces, signs, hints, clues, signals of who and when and what and where, in search of the always debatable and sometimes mutable why. Histories are not the past. The past is what happened. The discipline of history is the selection and arrangement of the evidence that remains from the past in an attempt to provide meaning for the present. Creating our histories has never been an easy task. The future of our histories certainly faces challenges. First of all, we live in an increasingly inauthentic world with our unreal, real TV housewives and their equally faux house-hunting counterparts. Do you ever notice they always pick the third house? Right? Vote them all off the island. Does anyone remember the video of Hitler dancing a jig at the capitulation of France? That was actually a manipulated copy of a film of the madman raising his jodhpurred leg and putting it back down again. It was difficult to make that piece of fakery for a good cause at the time by the Canadian Information Service, and it wasn't very convincing. But now we have artificial intelligence giving us a very good rendition of Johnny Cash singing a Barbie song. It is convincing, especially for all of us who would like Barbie to be placed a little farther down the line than Folsom Prison. But what does this inauthentic, pink-hued song by the Man in Black have to do with our future histories? Well, how will future historians know that a film, a recording, an electronic document, that piece of evidence required for real history will be, like that taste not born in the Carolinas, the real thing? Now there is something to work on. At this point, I probably should make a few suggestions for first steps along the lines of identifying the faux digital constructions. But I take after my Papa McCall, and when it comes to technical matters, if it can't be fixed with baling twine and duct tape, somebody else is going to have to do it. Before we work on this important non-baling twine fixable issue, we first have to make certain that our evidence survives. That's the second thing. There was once a time when humans carved lines in grand buildings, and when those great edifices fell, their shards gave hints of the civilizations that crafted them. There was once a time when ancient religious sects recorded their beliefs on animal skins, rolled them tightly, placed them in clay jugs, and buried them in the recesses of dry caves to await unearthing by shepherds 2,000 years later. There was once a time when monks copied ancient text after ancient text, passing them down through the generations, and rats and silverfish and floods and fire and invading armies did their work, and an astonishing amount of that material still survived. There was once a time when people kept diaries, wrote letters, scribbled out receipt books, and took photographs that actually appeared in physical form. And they put them in shoeboxes, and the shoeboxes in attics, and in those cloistered eave spaces, those scraps of lives lived, rested, and aged, and were protected through benign neglect and the inherent properties of their storage media. There once was a time when every crossroads community had a local newspaper recording obituaries and recipes, the times of church services, the scores of athletic events, the results of local elections, and the activities of clubs and schools, along with whatever misbehaviors could be found. And libraries bound them, microfilmed them, and later scanned them. And I might add, it was North Carolinians who led these efforts at preservation through microfilming the nation's records, and North Carolina institutions that forged the way in establishing digitization programs that led to mass scanning at the national level. Well, we won't have such a rich vein of newsprint to mine in the future. In the mid-20th century, it is estimated that there were about 24,000 newspapers in the country. In 2005, there were about 9,000. Today, there are about 6,000, and most of them carry the same set of stories with very little in-depth local information. Oh, and a little over 2 of those on average shut down every week. As someone who uses newspapers.com on a regular basis, I think I can say that this trend is going to change how we do history in the future. In the past, documentation and preservation happened in a willy-nilly fashion, but one which somehow worked. Institutions, governments, universities, hospitals, and banks have individuals dedicated to saving those records that we believe we might actually need again someday. In some cases, that even includes emails of decision makers, another system that North Carolinians helped develop. But the more important stories of who we are and who we have been, it could be argued, lies in those unofficial records that once resided in our attics. Not anymore. Who believes that all of those pictures on your iPhones and stored on your external hard drives, or even in a cloud floating way off in the ether of a well-connected metal building in the middle of nowhere, will exist 25 years after you have shuffled off this mortal coil? Who believes that your email will be tied up in the electronic equivalent of a ribbon and cherished by the grandchild of a recipient some decades after the send button was mashed? Most of us create more records in a day than our ancestors did in years, and we then commit them to the wind. If we are to preserve a future for our histories, we can't be passive. We can't wait on benign neglect to bring us in willy-nilly fashion the drips and drabs of history on long-lost floppy disks. Those things disappear faster than ham biscuits after a funeral. They are ephemeral. Oh, and no one uses them anymore anyway. We must actively intervene in the record-making process and document. Go after and get, not sit back and receive. We can't be taters. We can't be couch taters or hesitators or procrastinators. We got to go do. Yes, our evidence needs to be authentic, but where will the authentic evidence for our future histories come from if we don't go get it before it fades away? Now there is something else to work on. For us, an answer might mean teaching individuals and small institutions how to preserve their own electronic records and providing them with the centralized tools and systems to easily do so. It might also mean the creation of documentation teams as a part of the cultural enterprise. Oral historians, documentary videographers, active documentarian collectors of stuff. The State Archives has 2 oral historians, and several universities have a few professors and a handful of students involved in this kind of work on the side. It's the 50th anniversary of the Southern Oral History Program, by the way. Well, that ain't enough. Another example. The State Historic Preservation Office documents historic structures, but nowhere near the number it once did. And there are a number of counties that have not been resurveyed in more than 50 years. And we still have 2 counties that have never been surveyed, not even the first time. Y'all, buildings still get old and still become architecturally and historically significant. The built infrastructure of our world not only provides compelling settings for our stories, they contain the stories themselves within their very timbers. These are just a few suggestions for a few first steps. But before we work on helping authentic evidence survive, and this is number 3, we have to consider whose stories are being preserved and passed on. For too long, we have primarily collected stories of the elite and powerful, the people who knew they were important, so they made certain to create their own historical records and historical evidence and pass it on. Their records should still be collected. After all, they do still run things for the most part. But the rest of us deserve to have our stories preserved too. Studies show that people stand in house museum kitchens and talk about what they see there longer than they do in the fancy parlors, offices, and libraries. All of us want to know more about the folks that made those places run, not just stories about the people who ran those places. For the last decade at least, we cultural stewards have been emphasizing the collection of materials from African Americans and other minorities, and with the preservation of the Golden Franks home in Edenton, and the creation of the Thomas Day State Historic Site in Milton, and Freedom Park in Raleigh, as well as increased exhibitions, programming, and collecting across the board, we've had some successes. But there is much left to be done. Charlotte Hawkins Brown State Historic Site, with its large buildings, is opportunity all over the place. And the International Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro, the Woolworth's Lunch Counter Place, is the site of one of our best nationally known contributions to 20th century American history. It is a fine establishment, but one that could certainly be amplified. And where is our Native American Cultural Center for state-recognized tribes? And who is documenting the stories of our new immigrants? Something tells me that their Tar Heel descendants will someday want to know the stories of their ancestors' struggles and achievements. This is laudable work needing to be accomplished, but not all diversity is racial and ethnic. Sometimes it's about the subject matter itself. We have no historic site or museum that collects, preserves, and presents on a statewide basis the industry that made modern North Carolina textiles. There's opportunity in Franklinville and Cedar Falls, North Carolina's nascent state textile museum. I admit I may be prejudiced about this one. My grandmother tied the same knot for nearly 50 years. And my grandfather spent his life among the looms. And I want their story and those of their cousin co-workers given the prominence it deserves. It's not too bold a statement to say that their taxes built our roads and the Research Triangle, along with our much-lauded university and community college systems. And they flat out made most of the philanthropic families who continue to provide the funding for so many of this state's important undertakings. More than a few quality of life features that we now enjoy rest upon a foundation of Lent. Another subject matter example. No one will argue that the impact of the environment upon us and our impact upon it and the changes in that interaction over time is not worth studying and sharing. Up until fairly recently, environmental history has provided a backdrop to our other histories, but now it is stepping right up to the front of the stage. We might have a way to present this history. Our state park system maintains Rockcliffe Farm, the home of B.W. Wells, one of North Carolina's most significant environmentalists, located just north of Raleigh within Falls Lake State Recreation Area. It's a pretty good place to begin an environmental history center, telling the story of North Carolina's environmental leaders, the interaction of humans with their ecosystems, and the environmental justice movement, which began in this nation in our own Warren County. Our environmental story is, if you ask me, like our sea level rising. And it is a subject area that we dare not ignore in the stories that we tell to understand ourselves. And those are just two big examples of subject area diversity waiting to be better documented and told. Then there is the matter of geographic diversity. Believe it or not everything of significance in this state happens between Burlington and Wendell, Wake Forest, and Fuquay-Varina. Maybe it's time to think again about a flagship maritime museum, a branch of the Museum of History for our mountains, an affiliate of some kind near our population centers around Charlotte, all sharing exhibits and programming to make the most of their resources. We've made great strides in our historical diversification these last few years, and it is tempting to be like the little boy in the backyard who threw a baseball up in the air, swung his bat and missed. So he did it again, same result. And one more time, the same result, but this time he shouted, "What a pitcher!" We can look at what we have done and congratulate ourselves on our pitching, or we can start some batting practice. Now is no time to let up. And number 4, before we can collect this more diverse, authentic evidence, we have to better equip ourselves for the important work of collecting, preserving, and providing access. I don't know if y'all know this or not, but collecting, storing, and presenting the evidence of the past is not a cheap enterprise. It takes people who need to be paid and space that needs to be kept safe, secure, and temperature controlled. And because history is a growing industry, after all, the need for space and sometimes even people expands from time to time, even when you're storing bits and bytes. I also don't know if y'all know this or not, but funding for the cultural enterprise has not really kept up with inflation these last few decades. And it is a testament to the energy, hard work, and creativity, sheer passion in most instances, of my colleagues in libraries, archives, museums, and sites, that they are able to craft the amount of bricks that they do with the amount of straw that they have been given. But even passion can only go so far. And now the stewardship challenge that these memory workers face is, in the words of the immortal Barney Fife, big, real big, big, big. As support for the nation's libraries, archives, museums, and historic sites has been seriously reduced over the last few decades, and not just in North Carolina or the United States. Pressure on these institutions has led them to make very difficult decisions regarding what to collect, not nearly as much as before. And to even consider selling historic structures, because let's face it, old buildings can be expensive and new buildings cost less to maintain. That is, until they fall apart right after their builders die. Guess what? There are more people now doing more and different things, and not all plowing the same furrow in the same red clay just in the next county over. This means that there are all sorts of different stories needing to be captured. Can we save everything? To quote Shakespeare's Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2, line 87, no. I am not advocating saving everything, although you wouldn't know it if you waded through my own house. Yes, the historical enterprise, even when highly curated, is expensive, but it's more expensive to forget. H.M. was an epilepsy patient at MIT who volunteered for experimental surgery, which left him with the inability to form long-term memories. He had normal intelligence, he was kind and congenial, but he had no way to function because he lacked understanding. And he had no understanding because he had no memory. H.M. died in 2009 at the age of 82, and his life contributed significantly to the understanding of epilepsy, but only because the people who worked with him could form memories. We cannot afford to become a civilization that can't store the memories that make up our histories. We have to invest more in our past to have a more understandable future. This is not a Houdini and trapdoor situation. It's not a stage we're passing through. We have to prepare for the long run. That means we can't continue to collect, preserve, and make accessible the mnemonics of our past in the same ways we always have. We must create new strategies around who collects what and what do we share, and ask ourselves, does every county history museum need to have a copy of the same rusty plow? But we can't stop collecting. If we held steady in our collecting with more people and more diverse activities, we actually fall behind in our collecting. For us, this might mean regional cultural storage. Let's call them curatorial centers, where institutions, small to large, share the cost of stewardship. Yes, it's nice to have materials in the middle of campus or only 100 yards away from a government office, but it's even better to be able to take care of what needs to be preserved and wouldn't be kept because there's no space within walking distance of the exhibit case. Another answer might be county-level stewards. Way back in the 1970s, there was an attempt to install a county historian in every county. That was a pretty good idea. A few counties still have them, mainly as employees of public libraries, but most of those few that do still exist aren't given the resources required to collect, preserve, and make accessible original information about their areas. A refocusing of their efforts, a ramping up of their resources, and an expansion of their number would help take up the slack for what the Dukes, Chapel Hills, Wake Forest, App States, WCUs, ECUs, and NC States among us just can't do, including that active documentation. No need to pursue this line of equine necroflagellation further. Simply put, to have authentic, representative evidence and make sure that it survives, cultural institutions have to be bold and stretch and change while building new support. And like some of the best things in libraries, it is overdue. Now, there is yet something else to work on. Before we get this new support for the future of our authentic, diverse histories, and this is the last one, we have to know why all of this effort and expense is worth it. We all have to answer this question for ourselves. Some say it's to teach ourselves civics. Who can argue against civics lessons these days? And there's that old saw about those who don't know history, yada, yada, and history repeating itself, and Twain's line that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I believe one-liners such as these should be rejoined. Human experience is too complex for all that mess. Still, we can find historical parables if we look. We can find models of behavior and certainly misbehavior in the past, and if we twist about, hold our heads right, salt the footnotes, and select just the right quotations, we can find a lesson or two. Now all we have to do is learn from those lessons. For me, I side with the writer Wendell Berry. And for those of you who've worked with me for any time, you have heard me quote this, and you maybe have even read it on that little piece of paper above my desk. Berry reminds us that, quote, when a community loses its memory, its members no longer know each other. How can they know each other if they've forgotten or never learned each other's stories? If they do not know each other's stories, how can they know whether or not to trust each other? People who do not trust each other do not help each other. And moreover, they fear each other. Close quote. Knowing my history and knowing your history and knowing our shared histories is about building community. Preserving our histories is the foundation for mutual understanding and stronger community. That's what I think. And I think we all just might agree that we can use a bit more community in our world. After all, if you want to change how people act, you have to change how they think. And to change how they think, you have to change how they feel. Our best historic sites, museum exhibitions, immersive programming, and even a bit of pomp and ceremony on occasion goes a long way toward making us feel and then think, and maybe sometimes act differently. I could go on, and I'd hope to mention the need to expand the auto exhibits and address air travel at the North Carolina Transportation Museum, and the promise of an expanded and renovated Main History Museum in Raleigh, and the need for more emphasis on our Revolutionary and World War II histories, and the expansion of our online North Carolina history textbook, NC Anchor, which can be so much more than a textbook, and a possible expanded role for the historic sites located in our state park system, and the importance of National History Day for school children, and the glories of the North Carolina Historical Review, and the promise of outdoor educational play spaces as well as indoor visible storage facilities, and the more multidisciplinary approach to historic sites being explored at Hayes, and potential new gallery and natural history spaces at Tryon Palace, and the need to protect sites' viewscapes through increased buffer land, and what the popularity of the Highway Historical Marker Program tells us about taking history directly to the people, and the need for a new generation of historic carpenters, masons, plasterers. Did you know the last time that I checked, there was only one historic plasterer left in the state of North Carolina? I meant to talk about all of that. And is all of that and the rest just pie in the sky? Well, I found that the best tasting pie tends to reside way up there. So let's start piling up a mound to stand on, building a ladder, standing on our tiptoes and stretching. We might not get the whole pie, but we might be able to reach a slice or two of some of that sweet stuff while someone else is rounding up a higher mound and building an even longer ladder. If I went much longer, you would see that there is no talent to my end. Shoot. If I went much longer, I'd be tempted to tell you how many kegs of nails went into my home place, according to Uncle Horace, and what my great-great-grandfather's favorite dog's name was, Chief. But I better stop. Just as few undertakings, if worthwhile, are ever successfully addressed by one person or even a handful of people. No worthy project is ever truly, totally finished. I never did find Cousin Ralph's finger after all. First cousin, 2 times, and a digit removed. Thank you.